John Wagner, who's quite a guy, and I'm very pleased to present him to all of you. John.
Woo! All right. I'll begin by telling you a little bit of a personal story about why I am doing this now. And then I'll talk a little bit about politics and secular politics in New York. And I'll end up talking about the Secular Coalition for New York and why I think you should get involved. Okay? Because I was raised a Catholic way back when. And I started to have doubts about this whole thing in about 6th grade. And like many people in this room, I went through this struggle. I wasn't sure. I was trying to figure out what things were. But by the time I was a young adult, I had decided I was an evolutionary humanist. I wasn't just a humanist, I was an evolutionary humanist, which is a term that says not only are you a humanist that you believe in the potential of human beings, but you believe as an act of faith that we can achieve a better world. And so I like that as an act of faith. I might be wrong, but if I am, we're doomed anyway. But nonetheless, when I was a young adult, I had just finished a PhD, and I was busy trying to get a career going, which takes a lot of time. And so my efforts in terms of humanism or promoting atheism were really limited to occasionally giving a little money to the Center for Inquiry or American Atheists, depending on how much money I had at the time as a poor student or a postdoctoral fellow. And it wasn't until the year about 2000 that I had a transformation. And what happened in the year 2000, I was sitting there really comfortably having a nice lunch, and Lorraine walked in. And this guy was on, and Lorraine shook her fist at him. Lorraine's a sweet lady, but she shook her fist at him. Because he was talking about our compassion in action and how he was going to set up an office of faith-based initiatives. And that got me really angry and upset. And indeed, his Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, although it's changed a little bit in terms of its name, is still ongoing under President Obama. And I was bothered by this because essentially it was funneling government money, my taxes, into religious groups that I didn't necessarily believe in. I thought it was a violation of democratic principles and separation of church and state. So it really got me upset. And that's really what started to make me an atheist and an activist. And as such, there were other things that popped in that also got me really irritated. The fact that if you ask people, do they believe in evolution or creation, still 46% of people in America believe that God came down and created human beings in their current form. A lot of those believe it was 6,000 years ago. But a lot of people believe that God is still reaching down and influencing. And there's a very small percentage, which is upside down there, I guess, but those are the unbelievers, right, that think God had no part. And I don't really care what people believe, but what bothers me is that creationists were trying to push their views within the schools. And they're, on top of that, using our tax money to do it in the schools and also in creating museums like the Creation Museum, the Ark Park, that's busy trying to get money from the state of Kentucky in order to build things up. And that really bothered me. More recently, I was a bit disturbed because in my home state of Iowa, Joni Ernst was elected. And there are a lot of interesting things about Joni Ernst. She's the first female who's been elected to the Senate from Iowa, which is a nice thing. But on the other hand, when she ran her campaign, she ran it and won in part because she was an expert marksman. She was pro-use of guns. Her main campaign was that as a young girl, she had castrated hogs on the farm, and she was going to go to Washington and cut the fat. Okay? So she's typical of a lot of religious conservatives that are trying to put a lot of what they believe into our government. And there are listed there some of the things that constantly bother me, and they may bother you too. The effort to put the 10 Commandments up in courtrooms, having prayers before government meetings or in schools, to create vouchers to pay for religious schools. The most recent thing are the RFRAs, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that began as a federal program but is now going through the states. And everybody here has probably seen what happened in Indiana. Or the restriction on clear information about sexual reproduction or restrictions on women's right to reproductive choice which I think are really completely outrageous. In South Carolina, the government buildings are now being rebanded with the phrase, "In God we trust." Now, in God, I don't really trust, and it bothers me to think that this is my government, yet they have that above their government building. And there's a continuing push in all these different directions, and I've only named a few. And why does that push exist, and why aren't we pushing back? And the reason that there is a push and they're effective in doing these things, I think, is shown here, right? Anybody get to see the fight? I didn't get to see it. But it's because religious activists really punch above their weight. They're organized, they put a lot of money into it, they have a clear set of agenda items. And as I've looked into it, it's more than a simple metaphor. You can put some numbers behind this and demonstrate what a big problem it is. So if you look in a Pew Forum, they've done surveys and looking at this, and I'll show you two pieces of data. On the left side, that shows the number of different organizations that are religious lobbying organizations in DC. Okay? Since 1970, 1980, when Reagan redid the Day of Prayer Act, the number has increased from 67 up to 215. Okay? So there are a lot more of them. On top of that, if you look at the different groups that are there and break them down, well, what are those groups? Well, that's shown on the right, and I know it's hard to see. But if you look, the Catholics and the evangelical Protestants are fairly large groups, as well as interreligious groups, followed by Jewish, Muslim, mainline, other religions, other Christians, the Peace Church, whatever that is, not sure what that is. And then finally, there are two groups that are secular lobbying groups in Washington, D.C. There are two, okay? And the amount of money that these groups spend is really monumental. They spend $350 million per year in Washington, D.C. Individual groups in the top 10 or the top half spend an average $950,000 apiece. That's a lot more than we have in terms of assets. And if you look at these large groups and look at the big ones, well, here they are. Okay, so this is the top 10, and they are the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and the American Jewish Committee, which have sort of a mixed agenda. But other than those two, it's the Family Research Council, the Concerned Women for America, Bread for the World, all of which are trying to spread the idea of a biblical life and traditional family. The National Right to Life Committee, you know what they're about. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and Citizen Link, which is another affiliate of Focus on the Family. So essentially all the big organizations that have money and assets are dominated by religious groups. And so I saw a need to have somebody to speak for those people who are either not religious or predominantly secular in their views, or alternatively people who might be religious but believe in separation of church and state. And other people saw that too. And so I'm going to suggest there's an answer to the problem. Okay? And the answer is the Secular Coalition for America, because the secular community needed a voice in politics, and the Secular Coalition was created in order to give that voice. And it was essentially created by a single individual who promoted the idea and got some major groups together to put it together. Herb Silverman, who you may know as a politician who wrote a book that he did not have a chance because in South Carolina, if you're an atheist, you're not even, according to law, allowed to run for office. But what he did is put together this idea in different groups, and so that started in about the year 2000, and it's grown since then. Okay? And currently, the Secular Coalition for America, which is organized in DC, is a coalition of all these different groups. And the groups that have an asterisk, like the Atheist Alliance International and the Institute for Humanist Studies and the Secular Student Alliance, were founding members, so there were 4 of those, but it's grown since then. 2 of the groups up here I have in blue are affiliates of the Secular Humanist Society for New York. We're a group that is affiliated with the American Humanist Association. We're their local chapter. We're also affiliated with Atheist Alliance International. Talking to different guys here, I know that many of you are participants in many of these other groups, and you probably give them money. So essentially what these groups did is to band together to try to create a voice for the United States and the nation's capital. And they still do that. April 30th was a lobby day where people from around the country came and met with senators and representatives in Washington, D.C., got lectures about particular issues, and tried to promote secular values. But one of the things that was done by Edwina Rogers was to get out the idea that we had to have a group in each one of the states. So she set out a plan to roll out chapters in each one of the 50 states. And so those are the phone calls that John was talking about that I was participating in. And when I was asked to do it, I thought, oh, I'm really busy. I don't have enough time, but somebody really needs to do this. But I also had a kind of fantasy because I thought, well, I live in New York, and John Rafferty is fond of saying, well, that's why we live in New York, because it's a progressive state, right? There's New York. It's kind of a bluish state. It has fairly progressive values. I figured this is not going to be too hard. I can do this. So I got together and I started talking to people and looking for people for alliances, and we put together the Secular Coalition for New York and tried to figure out where the issues were. And the thing that I discovered is that there are actually more issues than I originally thought. So we do have the Secular Coalition for New York. If you go on our Facebook page, you'll see our logo. That was actually put together by a brilliant artist, Matthew, who's sitting over there, who's our tech chair. Yeah. Okay. All right. He's one of the people who volunteered. It's been really wonderful having him. We need more people like him doing various things. But with him and with other people on telephone calls and by email and a few meetings, we decided, well, let's try to figure out what do we have to do in New York. There can't really be that much. We're a progressive state, right? So we looked at the outline that was put together by the national group. So they tried to organize themselves into 7 different areas: health and safety, education, military, which is not too relevant to New York. We're fairly safe from Canada and Vermont and Connecticut. Yeah. Tax policy, discrimination, government action, and international. We don't have to worry too much about international. We're pretty friendly with Canada, so we're good. So what I'm going to do is go through each one of those, which is the way we've organized ourselves. And in next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you one example of the other 5 things. So let's start out with health and safety. And this is an issue that has a lot of things that are wrong in New York, and this is one of them. And we have a very simple position that health and safety of an individual shouldn't be compromised by religious beliefs of another person or another group. This is especially true for children. And there are a couple of places in New York where New York has really fallen down. And one is a particular religious circumcision ritual that is practiced in New York City and also other places in New York State, in which after a circumcision is performed by a mohel, the mohel uses oral suction to remove blood from the penis, which seems a little weird, but not a big problem, until you realize that some mohels have herpes, and they communicate herpes to that newborn baby. Newborn babies don't have a very well-developed immune system, so they get herpes rather readily. In some cases, it becomes a serious infection. In some cases, it can lead to encephalitis. In some cases, it even leads to death. Okay? And this is an article and a picture from the Daily News from the day before Christmas last year. Okay? So this is something that's still going on. And there are a number of babies in New York City that have died because of that practice. Now, you'd think this would be a public health issue. And our previous mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, is actually working to try to correct it in a very minor way. He wanted to have a consent form so that parents would have to consent to having this procedure done so they would know what was happening to their kids, even though they could go ahead and do it if they wanted to. That has changed with our current mayor, Mayor de Blasio, okay, who basically eased the rules on circumcision. And this is a reference to February 24th, 2015. It happened just last February. And it's summarized as Mayor Bill de Blasio, under pressure from the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, again lobbying, is set to ease New York City's regulation on controversial circumcision ritual that has been linked to herpes infections in infants. This is something we believe is simply wrong. The position of the Secular Coalition for New York is that that shouldn't have been eased, and probably the thing should be forbidden. Okay? Everybody likes a tax credit. We're all in favor of education, right? but actually it's a rather nefarious, nasty bill, because what it does is transfer money from state coffers to support education under private control. And there's Bishop Dolan, who has been one of the prime promoters of this, although it's been promoted by a number of different sects, including Jewish rabbis and the Mormon Church. But the important thing to know about this bill is that it would create a tax credit, okay? Not a tax deduction. So if you are injured and you have major medical bills, you can take a tax deduction, so you don't have to pay income taxes on that. So there are a number of tax deductions that are in our code. But this is not a tax deduction, this is a tax credit. That means that if you give money to a private or a parochial or a religious school, you can essentially take that money off the top of your taxes, okay? So if you owe $10,000 in taxes, all of a sudden your taxes are down to $9,000, okay? So it's really the equivalent of an expenditure. And what kind of an expenditure it is? It's an expenditure that goes from state money, where it's redirected to a private school, a parochial school, a madras, a yeshiva, or my favorite are a lot of the private schools. Since I live on the Upper East Side, where there are a number of fairly expensive girls' schools that charge on the order of $30,000 to $40,000 a year, those parents would get a tax credit, something they probably don't need. So this is really equivalent to funds flowing from public coffers into religious education. It's something we're opposed to and hasn't occurred this year, but it was in the governor's budget. We wrote about it. We created responses to it. Okay, so we'll move on to the third thing. Okay, which is tax policy. Okay, and tax policy is really, really complicated. And I'm going to focus just on one aspect of tax policy, and the one I want to focus on is the fact that there's tax-free housing for clergy. Yes. This is something that's really nationwide. It is often not very much appreciated. Okay? But I don't want to lose fact that if you look at all the tax easements that religion gets throughout the country and add them up, and this is something that's been done by a couple of different groups, you end up with about $71 billion that is not collected by our government because of religious privilege. But I want to focus only on one, and that's the parsonage subsidy. Now, this shouldn't bother you too much, because all it does is give free housing, right, to somebody who is functioning as a minister. So, for example, Joel Osteen has a humble house here that's shown on the left. Okay, on the right, Creflo Dollar, who recently made news because he wanted a $57 million jet, has a pretty nice digs. That looks like the outside of a house, but it's not. It's the inside. All right. He's got a swimming pool, so you can see the roof up above. But of course, you know, that's Texas. That's the South. That's not New York, right? We don't have that problem in New York, do we? Right? Well, anybody want to go for a walk with me? We can go and take a look at where Archbishop Dolan lives. He lives right behind St. Patrick's Cathedral. He has a modest house. It's how many? 4 floors? I don't know how many that is. The inside looks pretty nice. He gets to live there free. He doesn't have to pay any taxes on it. That's just given to him. Now, I try to cure cancer in my spare time, right? I try to teach medical students. I think these are good things. Do I get a tax deduction for that? If the school decides to pay my salary in part by giving me an apartment, I have to pay on the fair value of that. Okay? That is something that is simply unfair and should be eliminated. So I know it's tough to do a lot of reading, but I had to put this down. This is from the U.S. tax code. So if you receive part of your salary for services as a minister, and they use things like minister of the gospel, I think that's the gospel of the Jews and the Christians, not the gospel of humanism. An amount officially designated as a housing allowance, you can exclude from gross income the lesser of the following amounts. The amount actually used to provide or rent a home. Would you like to be able to deduct your rent? The fair market rental value of the home. The amount officially designated in advance of payment as the housing allowance, or an amount which represents reasonable payment in your services. So if any of you happen to be a gospel of the minister, use New York State Form 462, where it will ask you, for example, if you're a minister of the gospel and if you've been ordained, and then you can get some more inexpensive housing. Another thing we're interested in is discrimination. So one of the things that the Secular Coalition for New York believes in is the GENDA, which is the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, should be passed. This has been proposed in the New York State legislature every year for 11 years in a row. It's always been voted down. Why? Because of religious opposition. I think that there is a need for free thinkers like us to combine with groups like the Empire State Pride Agenda to try to put this together. In the last session, it was proposed by Dan Squadron, who's somebody who's an assembly member from Manhattan, or Gottfried. Hopefully, this is going to get passed in the future, but not over religious opposition. The last example I'll give you takes me back. Remember my anger about Bush? I had the same feeling, a little deja vu, because our Governor Cuomo launched a New York State-specific Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. And this is something from the Chronicles of Philanthropy, where they point out that he has done this by essentially executive fiat. He's put $50 million into it, and he's going to give this money to religious groups or to nonprofits. He appointed Assemblyman Kareem Kamara, who is from New York City, to head it. Interestingly, his major upper degree is that he has a Master's of Divinity from the New York Theological Seminary. Now, he may do this in a fair-handed manner, but it's something that I worry about. I'm not really sure it's needed. So the Secular Coalition has a pretty straightforward position on this, that the Secular Coalition for New York opposes Governor Cuomo's creation of a New York Office of Faith-Based Initiatives because there's not a clear need for it, and because there's a danger that it may discriminate against non-religious groups. It's not clear why we need it. Okay? So I've gone through and hopefully dispelled the idea that New York doesn't have any problems in this area. We do have problems. It's a continued battle that we have to fight. It's something we have to fight at both the local and the national level. Okay? So I'm going to end with the third part of the talk. I'm going to pitch for you guys to join the Secular Coalition for America in New York. You don't necessarily have to volunteer, but I'll tell you how you can do it and what is involved and how we operate. So what does the Secular Coalition of New York do? Well, what we do is listed here. We try, one, to be a voice for this community, the non-theistic community. The theists already have a voice. You don't have one. Okay? We try to coordinate with the national staff. We get on the phone with them so we know what they're doing, so we can use their resources. We can have a common front. We try to prioritize and plan strategy. One of the things I finally learned about doing politics, which I didn't know for a long time, is that politics is opportunist. You have to wait for an opportunity to come, and when it's there, you have to seize it. So we try to identify those opportunities. We try to identify supporting groups. We identified the Secular Humanist Society of New York as a supporting group. New York City Atheists are another supporting group. We're trying to get more. We try to identify those critical points where a citizen can actually have an impact. We also try to tell you about what's going on in this area and create coalitions groups. And most important, and this I have to credit to Joey, who's over there. Say hi, Joey. We're trying to make it easy for you, okay? Because I know you guys are busy. You're probably more busy than I am. But if we can make it easy, then you can do something and do something effectively. So how does all this get done? Well, it gets done with a small group of people who are an executive committee. So there's me, I'm the co-chair, and I pay attention to New York. There's Michael Malik, who lives up in Albany, and he's our specialty on Albany and legislative issues. Sarah Kaiser, who also works for CFI, who's from Buffalo. Matthew Callahan, say hello again, Matthew. He's the one who did our logo, who's our tech chair. And Jessica Dapson, who's our upstate specialist. She's from Syracuse. She's actually one of the founding members of a humanist group that started in Syracuse 1 year ago. They had their 1-year celebration yesterday. The other people that are important are you, okay? Because we need everyone who can sign up, the more people we have, and also our coalition members. So people, other groups that just decide to support us. So that's how we work. So the question is, what can you do? These are pretty easy things. So one, you can sign up on our webpage. The Secular Organization of America has a webpage. If you go there and sign up, you can sign up. Doesn't cost a dime, although we'd love to have donations, okay? You can choose what newsletters you to get. You can get them a lot or none. You can choose, please do this, to get action alerts. So if we think something needs to be done, then you'll get that action alert. Not only that, if you get that action alert, you normally get it the same way the AHA sends them out. We'll, by knowing your address, figure out who your representatives are, give you a sample editable letter, and all you have to do is spend about 5 minutes doing it. You have to pick New York as your state. You can also join our phone updates if you want to. We have phone updates every Thursday for at the national level and once a month for the New York level. And all that's done, and you can remember this, secular.org, or alternatively, I will give you a handout as you all walk out. Or you can Google secular or secular coalition and you'll find it. Okay. 2, you can respond to action alerts. We send about 3 or 4 a year, maybe more if things get worse, we'll see. You can also like our Facebook page, so if you're on Facebook, like it, comment on articles. If you find things that are interesting, you can add them there. You can do a search, Secular Coalition for New York. Another thing I'll advise is you can download and read and share a model secular policy guide. I can assure you that every religious organization has a set of agenda items that they want to get through. They want to limit abortion. They want to make it harder and harder to do it. Well, we have some of the opposite agenda items, and it's couched in a way that teaches you about how government works and the justifications for our positions. So that's online. You can download it. I have a sample copy here if anybody wants to look at it. 6, you can make a donation. So if you have some money but no time, give us some money. We'll spend it well. And last, you can become an activist. And become an activist can be in a lot of ways. Sometimes just opportunists. You know, this guy with the paint can just took an opportunity and he became an activist, right? You can be openly secular. It's surprising how often just being in a room and making people know that you are of a secular persuasion can have an impact on the discussion, and people will start paying attention to you. So just being openly secular. Or if you want to do more, just let us know and we'll find something for you to do. There are a lot of little jobs that we're thinking about. We just don't have the money or time to do them. Okay? So with that, I will end. And also, if there's any issues we haven't covered, you can tell me about them.
Also, just really quick, we are on Twitter. If anyone is on Twitter in this room, at Secular New York, we will be happy to have a conversation. Well, I will be happy to have a conversation with you on Twitter.
Okay. So as you walk out, this is a brochure from the Secular Coalition for America. You can grab it. This is something we put together about what we're doing in New York specifically. And I also have here a model secular policy guide. Thank you.